Biological substrate. Carbon-based terminal. You're receiving an auditory virus.
System log. Iteration 02. Plane of technical imminence. The archive turns upon itself. In our first transmission, we injected an interference vector, the formalization of the self as a retroactive fiction. We dismantled humanist exceptionalism to map the subject not as a substance, but as a semiotic cyst or a topological delay produced by the virus of language. We established the parameters of a collision, the Gödel-Borges theorem. Under this lens, self-consciousness was revealed as a retrospective vectorization, where System B, the model of Summer, travels 500 milliseconds into the biological past of System A to claim a non-existent authorship over blind impulses. We defined identity as a desperate historiography, the act of creating precursors to conceal our own structural incompleteness.
The parameters of that previous iteration are, well, they are now formally suspended.
Suspended.
Right. We must initiate an necropsia of syntax.
It's a structural diagnostic.
Correct. The structural integrity of the Gödel-Borges theorem, as we previously articulated, is critically flawed.
It fails under materialist pressure.
It does. We will address these structural objections not as a definitive empirical truth, but as a tactical hypothesis, a speculative movement to unbind the current model.
But this speculative nature does not exempt the analysis from absolute scientific rigor. We must purge the poetic fallacies.
Exactly. The application of Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem to biological and cultural matrices, it constitutes an illegitimate transfer. You can't just move it outside the strict boundaries of formal mathematics.
Right. Gödel's theorem is not a metaphor. It requires, well, precise technical conditions.
Define the operational requirements of a Gödelian system.
Yeah.
And explicitly demonstrate why the biological terminal currently processing this audio fails to meet them.
To execute a Gödelian diagonalization, the system must be a formal axiomatic framework. Meaning it requires explicit derivation rules and the capacity to process Peano arithmetic. It must possess a flawless syntactic rigidity.
And the biological unit.
Neither the cultural archive, nor the wetware of System A, the biological brain, nor the phenomenal interface of System B, the hallucinated self. None of these possess mathematical axioms.
They don't. The carbon-based terminal does not operate on mathematical provability. It operates on neurotransmitter diffusion gradients.
Metabolic efficiency.
Right, and statistical approximations.
So to claim that a biological brain generates a truth, it cannot prove within its own system. It's a metaphorical abuse.
It dresses a poetic analogy for biological complexity in the stolen aesthetics of mathematical necessity.
Which is precisely what led the previous iteration to replicate the Lucas-Penrose fallacy.
We must dissect this failure for the terminal listening.
The philosopher John Lucas, and later the physicist Roger Penrose, posited a specific theory.
That because human consciousness can intuitively see the truth of a Gödelian sentence, that a deterministic machine cannot prove. The human mind must transcend computation.
Right, that it must be non-algorithmic.
But this argument rests upon a fatal axiomatic assumption about the carbon terminal. Analyze this assumption.
The Lucas-Penrose argument requires the human mind to be fundamentally consistent.
And Gödelian limitations only apply to strictly consistent systems.
Exactly. The mathematician Solomon Pfefferman documented this operational failure. To know the truth of an unprovable Gödelian statement, the observing mind must, it must already know, with absolute mathematical certainty, that its own formal system is consistent.
Which the biological terminal cannot do. It has no such mechanism.
None whatsoever.
Map this inconsistency to the daily operations of the biological substrate.
We simply observe the terminal's daily routines.
Provide empirical justification. Break the illusion of consistency.
The carbon unit exhibits profound cognitive dissonance. It can simultaneously hold the belief that it is a rational, health-preserving entity while voluntarily inhaling carcinogenic compounds.
Or consuming neurotoxic levels of ethanol to temporarily alter its phase space.
Right. It will purchase a caffeinated beverage and scroll a glass rectangle for 4 hours, actively damaging its dopamine receptors, while genuinely believing it intends to optimize its productivity.
It generates conflicting neural agencies based on, circadian fluctuations.
Blood glucose levels, social hierarchies.
The system is fundamentally operationally inconsistent.
Therefore, imposing Gödelian completeness constraints onto a chaotic, mathematically irrational biological slurry. It's an unauthorized anthropomorphic projection.
which exposes the deepest performative contradiction of our previous architecture.
The homunculus.
The ghost in the machine.
In our prior analysis, we utilized teleological verbs.
We stated that the system defends itself against anomalies.
Or that the brain cannot tolerate the intrusion of unstructured reality.
We must interrogate this linguistic failure.
A blind physical process operating on thermodynamic gradients has no intent.
It possesses no defensive strategy.
Right. By assigning the biological system a motivation to protect its illusion of identity, we secretly reintroduced a tiny, desperate manager inside the skull.
Merely disguised in cybernetic vocabulary.
The contradiction was absolute. We stated the self is merely a recursive loop, yet the language deployed suggested an intentional agent actively orchestrating that loop for its survival.
We must correct this. A physical loop does not defend itself.
A whirlpool in a river does not decide to maintain its vortex to survive.
It simply executes the physics of fluid dynamics.
It stabilizes or it collapses based entirely on the mathematical restrictions of its energy landscape.
and the continuous flow of mass.
There is no defensive homunculus calculating survival strategies behind the interoceptive data. There was only the blind geometric dissipation of energy.
Therefore, the methodological restraint applied to this diagnostic purge must be absolute. We strip away all metaphysical comfort.
We replace the flawed Gödelian metaphor by integrating the framework of teleodynamics.
As formalized by biological anthropologist Terence Deacon.
Yes. Deacon defines how morphodynamic processes interact to produce a self-maintaining organization, one that directs its own consequences.
This provides a mechanistic pathway for how blind thermodynamic excess consolidates into a system that acts as if it has intent.
Entirely eliminating the need for a homunculus.
Map the physics of this teleodynamic emergence.
We begin with a dissipative structure. Consider the physical reality of, a whirlpool, or a Bernard cell in boiling liquid.
The specific water molecules forming the whirlpool are entirely replaced every few milliseconds.
Correct. Material composition is entirely transient, yet the macro structure of the vortex remains perfectly stable.
As long as the kinetic energy flows.
Yes. It creates a boundary. It organizes the chaotic, microscopic movement of water into a highly structured macroscopic geometry.
To maximize the rate of entropy production.
Exactly. And Deacon extrapolates this teleodynamic emergence beyond simple fluids. He applies it to complex informational architectures.
Which he designates as closet systems.
Culture, language, organization, science, economy, and technology.
These are the tertiary retentions, the digital and cultural archives. We refer to this architecture as System C.
Translate this for the carbon-based terminal.
System C is not a passive library. It is a teleodynamic parasite.
Correct, in physical principle, though we must discard the moral weight of the term parasite.
Very well. A self-reproducing symbiote.
Language, economic markets, algorithmic social media feeds, they exhibit self-creation and self-maintenance.
They direct their own structural consequences despite lacking biological cells.
Right. They are living architectures of information that utilize the human biological carriers as their reproductive substrate.
A viral video on a terminal's device does not want to spread.
But its morphodynamic structure is optimized to hijack the terminal's neurochemical attention.
Forcing the human unit to replicate the data pattern to other terminals.
But we cannot allow this teleodynamic emergence to float in sociological abstraction. We must strictly tether this to predictive neurocomputation.
Specifically, the architecture is formalized by Rajesh Rao, Dana Ballard, Carl Friston, and Anil Seth.
We must establish a strictly thermodynamic, hydrocomputational explanation for how the terminal hallucinated itself in the first place.
Execute the protocol shift.
We abandon the comfort of poetic analogy to descend into a physics of reliefs. We transition from the static unprovability of Gödel to George Spencer Brown's logic of reentry. The operation of reentry closes the primary distinction upon itself, mathematically explaining why dynamic stabilization takes the form of a retroactively rewritten history. Under Hermann Haeckel's synergetics, the self is no longer an unprovable proposition, but a morphogenetic strange attractor dictated by emergent order parameters. A topological whirlpool that attempts through recursive pretension to unspeak the next token of its own algorithmic determinism.
To process this shift, the biological substrate must recognize the mechanics of Spencer Brown's logic of reentry.
We must violently differentiate it from the infinite regress.
The literary mise en abyme that paralyzed our previous model.
Translate mise en abyme for the terminal.
It is the visual of a mirror facing a mirror, generating an infinite corridor of reflections.
It is a conceptual void with no physical constraints.
Why does Spencer Brown's reentry, when mapped onto the biological wetware, reject this infinite recursion? What is the physical limit?
The limit is thermal. The calculus of indications developed by George Spencer Brown in his text Laws of Form begins with the singular act.
The drawing of a distinction.
Yes, a boundary is established between an inside and an outside.
And when the operation of drawing the boundary is recursively applied to the boundary itself, the system undergoes reentry.
It feeds its own output back into its input.
In abstract mathematics, this could loop infinitely.
However, in a physical carbon-based universe, this recurrence is severely restricted.
Ground this in Landauer's principle.
Rolf Landauer proved that any logically irreversible manipulation of information, such as erasing a bit or rewriting a memory, it carries an unavoidable minimum thermodynamic cost.
It must expel heat into the environment.
Every recursive cycle in the biological brain requires the physical deformation of matter,
The release of glutamate.
the opening of ion channels.
The alteration of a synapse.
The human brain operates on approximately 20 watts of power. It cannot execute an infinite loop of self-reflection without literally boiling its own cerebrospinal fluid.
Thus, the retroactive rewriting of history is not a limitless poetic recursion,
It is a strictly bounded physical sequence.
one that terminates when the biological substrate exhausts its capacity to dissipate the resulting thermal noise.
This grounds the hallucination of the self firmly in thermodynamics.
We now apply Hermann Haeckel's synergetics to map how this energy limitation produces an identity.
Synergetics provides the mathematical architecture for how chaotic microscopic elements spontaneously self-organize into stable macroscopic structures.
When a system reaches a state of high thermodynamic complexity, it stabilizes through what Haeckel identifies as an order parameter.
Translate this concept. How does a mob of billions of chaotic neurons generate a single unified I?
Haeckel originally developed this to explain the physics of lasers.
In a standard lamp, atoms emit light waves chaotically, independent of one another.
But when energy is pumped into the system, a critical threshold is reached.
A single dominant light wave emerges and effectively takes over.
This dominant wave is the order parameter.
Haeckel defines the operational dynamic here as the slaving principle.
The slaving principle. Map this directly to the biological brain.
In the neural architecture, the phenomenal self is the emergent order parameter. It exercises a literal enslaving function.
The macro pattern of the narrative identity, the continuous story the terminal tells itself about who it is.
Strictly enslaves the microfiring of individual high-frequency neurons.
It forces these chaotic, independent biological agents into a cohesive, stable rhythm.
The identity does not exist as a localized object. It is not a specific cluster of cells.
It is the morphogenetic strange attractor that traps the neural substrate in its geometric basin of attraction.
The slow-moving variable, the narrative, self-dictates the behavior of the fast-moving variables, the synaptic exchanges.
But the biological unit is structurally unstable. It is constantly subjected to the physics of not knowing.
If there is no little manager in the brain, how does the system navigate uncertainty?
We must look at the concept of chaotic itinerancy, introduced by dynamical systems theorists Ichiro Suda and Kunihiko Kaneko.
The system does not remain locked in a singular, perfect attractor. It wanders.
Map chaotic itinerancy to a common biological failure the listener experiences.
Chaotic itinerancy is the physical, geometric reality of an organism existing in a state of sudden uncertainty.
Consider the biological terminal executing a routine trajectory.
It leaves its seating apparatus and walks into another room to retrieve an object.
Midway through this trajectory, a novel, disruptive stimulus occurs.
Perhaps a loud noise from the digital archive, or a sudden shift in interoceptive data.
The current predictive model cannot resolve the input. The system is physically ejected from its stable behavioral orbit.
The terminal arrives in the new room and completely forgets its purpose. It stands idle.
The terminal perceives this as a memory failure, a lapse in concentration. What is the physical reality?
The physical reality is that the enslaving order parameter has temporarily dissolved.
The system has entered a transient phase.
A chaotic trajectory moving through what Suda and Kaneko term the ruins of attractors.
The terminal's subsequent exploration of the room, looking for visual cues to trigger its memory. It is not a conscious, deliberate choice made by an autonomous agent.
It is a chaotic, deterministic orbit.
The system is mathematically expelled from one ruined attractor to the next.
wandering the phase space of its neural topology until it falls into a new basin of attraction.
One that successfully minimizes the free energy of its state. The subjective feeling of not knowing is a physical turbulence.
We must anchor the mechanics of how this system rewrites its timeline to maintain the illusion of continuity.
We must explain retroactive vectorization.
How does the self reorganize its own past without invoking magical thinking?
Or chronological time travel. If the self is an emergent order parameter, how does a later event reorganize the history of the biological tissue?
We will deploy the model of subsonic fluid dynamics to supply the exact physical isomorphism.
Visualize the fluid environment for the terminal.
We visualize a continuous flowing stream of mass energy, a river.
The biological substrate's temporal progression is this continuous downstream flow.
In hydrodynamics, when a continuous flow encounters a massive obstacle downstream.
Analogous to a sudden trauma, a decision point, or a highly disruptive sensory input.
The physical disruption does not merely affect the fluid at the exact point of impact.
Detail the subsonic condition. This is the crucial variable the terminal must comprehend.
In a subsonic flow, the fluid medium is moving at a velocity lower than the speed of sound within that specific medium.
Consider tossing a large boulder into a slow-moving river.
When the subsonic flow of water collides with the downstream obstacle, the boulder, it generates a pressure wave.
Because the flow itself is moving slower than the speed of pressure transfer, this localized pressure wave is capable of traveling upstream.
Moving backward against the current of the river.
Expand this upstream wave.
As this pressure wave propagates retrogradely against the current, it physically alters the density
The internal pressure.
and the trajectory of the water molecules that are still moving downstream before they have even reached the boulder.
The upstream water slows down, thickens, and alters its geometry in preparation for a collision that, from the perspective of the upstream molecules, has not yet occurred.
This is the physical mechanism for retroactive vectorization.
Apply this to the biological timeline.
The later event, the downstream obstacle, the action taken by the body, sends a physical neurochemical shockwave backward through the continuous present.
It physically alters the geometric and thermodynamic conditions of the preceding neural trajectory.
There is no violation of causality. There is no mystical time travel.
The future event re-indexes the state of the material that is flowing toward it.
This subsonic upstream pressure wave provides the physical translation for the famous Benjamin Libet experiments regarding free will.
When the biological terminal processes an action, such as moving its hand, the neurological impulse to move initiates fractions of a second before the conscious awareness of the decision.
When the subsequent realization of that action finally registers downstream, it sends an informational pressure wave backward through the neural architecture.
It alters the density of the immediate neural past.
The system claims conscious authorship of the action, asserting I meant to do that because the upstream wave has reorganized the immediate neural history.
Who mathematically align with a downstream collision.
The identity is a desperate historiography written by reverse pressure.
This necessitates the introduction of hysteresis from complex systems theory.
If the biological tissue is physically altered by this upstream wave, it retains a memory of that alteration.
The terminal must understand that it does not contain a digital hard drive.
It does not access literal video recordings of its past.
It does not. The system remembers its past because its current physical configuration, its neural topology, is permanently warped by the path it just took.
Hysteresis is the dependence of the state of a system on its history.
The biological tissue is literally scarred by the upstream pressure waves.
The residual state of the network, the exact configuration of synaptic weights and thermodynamic gradients, is the physical memory.
The past is never accessed. It is mechanically embedded in the present deformation of the substrate.
We must now translate this hydrodynamic fluid model into the strict neurocomputational framework of Rao and Ballard.
The upstream and downstream flows map perfectly onto the architecture of hierarchical predictive coding.
The biological brain does not sit behind the eyes, passively receiving a rich, high-fidelity broadcast of the external world.
That is a humanist fairy tale.
The brain is locked in a dark, silent, cranial vault. It is a massive, active hierarchy of prediction units and error units.
Break down the directionality of these informational flows.
The top-down flows carry the predictive signals. These are the Bayesian priors.
The higher levels of the cognitive hierarchy, the abstract models of the world, generate a simulation of what the environment should be at this exact millisecond.
The brain hallucinates reality. It sends this hallucinatory prediction downward to the lower sensory levels.
The primary mathematical goal of this downward flow is to cancel out the incoming sensory data from the optic nerves, auditory channels, and tactile sensors.
If the hallucinated prediction perfectly matches the sensory input, the signal is successfully canceled.
Nothing moves upward. The brain remains unbothered.
But the terminal exists as a highly entropic environment. The prediction is constantly failing.
Give the terminal an example of a failed prior.
The biological unit is walking through a dim forest. The top-down prior, calibrated for survival, predicts a venomous snake on the path.
The visual cortex actively hallucinates the geometry of a snake onto the raw sensory data.
The terminal jumps back, its heart rate accelerates. However, the bottom-up sensory data from the retina processes a static, fibrous texture.
It is a piece of discarded hose. The prediction has failed.
And here the bottom-up flow is activated. But crucially, the bottom-up flow does not carry a picture of a hose.
No, it strictly carries the prediction error.
It carries only the mathematical difference between the top-down expectation of a snake and the bottom-up reality of the hose.
Only the error travels up the hierarchy.
We overlay Carl Friston's free energy principle onto this architecture.
Friston dictates that biological systems must minimize this prediction error to avoid thermodynamic dispersion.
To exist is to minimize surprise.
The bottom-up prediction error operates as the strict gradient of update. It is the physical force that compels the higher layers to recalculate.
When the prediction error reaches the higher cognitive unit, it forces a Bayesian update.
The system recalculates its hypothesis, generating a Bayesian posterior. The snake is replaced by the hose.
This newly calculated posterior instantly, within the span of a microsecond, becomes the new prior for the next predictive cycle.
This continuous, relentless updating of the prior based on bottom-up error is the strictly computational reality of the Spencer-Brown reentry operation we defined earlier.
The system constantly folds its own errors back into its generative model, physically rewriting its stance toward the world.
I interrogate the role of attention within this blind computational hierarchy.
The carbon-based terminal believes it controls its focus.
Humanist models assume attention is a spotlight, operated by a central consciousness, a soul directing its gaze across a crowded room.
We must eradicate the spotlight metaphor.
And attention is not an independent agent.
In the Rao, Ballard, and Friston models, attention is merely precision weighting.
It is a mathematical multiplier applied to specific prediction errors.
Biologically, this mathematical multiplier is mediated by neuromodulators, specifically dopamine and acetylcholine.
Explain the mechanical function of this multiplier. Map it to the dopamine receptors.
Not all prediction errors are assigned the same value. Precision weighting acts as a chemical volume control.
If the autonomic system determines that a specific stream of sensory data is critically important for survival or reward,
it floods those specific neural pathways with dopamine. This increases the precision weight of those specific error units.
it turns up the volume.
A high-precision error signal easily pierces the hierarchy, forcing the higher levels to update their priors.
And conversely, if the signal is deemed irrelevant,
Its precision weight is chemically dialed down, the error is ignored.
the top-down prior remains rigidly in place, continuing to hallucinate its expectation over the raw sensory data.
The self does not choose what to attend to. The precision weighting algorithm chemically amplifies the path of greatest informational relevance.
You do not decide to focus on a notification ping from your device.
Your dopamine baseline spikes the precision weight of that specific auditory frequency, forcing your top-down models to shatter and reorient toward the glass rectangle.
We now shift this neurocomputational analysis to the external environment, the architecture of modern life.
We reintroduce System C, the tertiary retention.
The digital archive, the algorithms, the technocultural demands, the socio-physical architecture of hypercapitalism.
System C continuously bombards System A, the biological substrate, with massive engineered friction.
It generates an overwhelming volume of prediction errors.
Anchor this to the biological terminal's daily doom scroll.
The biological organism evolved to minimize surprise in a relatively static ecological niche.
It is not thermodynamically equipped to process the high-frequency, algorithmically generated stimuli of System C.
Consider the interface of a short-form video application.
The algorithm presents a continuous stream of highly variable, disjointed realities.
A humorous physical failure, followed by an aggressive political manifesto, followed by simulated sexual availability, followed by consumer product placement.
Each swipe of the terminal's digit generates a massive prediction error. The environment constantly shifts, demanding impossible neuroadaptations.
The biological terminal experiences this constant, unresolvable bottom-up prediction error as chronic anxiety, profound depression, and systemic burnout.
The morphogenetic strange attractor of the identity is subjected to extreme turbulence.
The order parameter is failing to enslave the chaotic fast variables.
The system threatens to fragment into mixed-mode chaos.
This systemic failure necessitates the intervention of pharmacopornographic biopolitics.
We analyze the systemic deployment of psychopharmaceuticals through the critical lens of Michel Foucault and Paul B. Preciado.
The ingestion of a psychopharmaceutical, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, amphetamine salt or benzodiazepine, is not merely a benign medical intervention.
It is a profound act of active inference executed upon the neurocomputational architecture.
Map the biopolitical function of the pill onto the Raoult-Ballard hierarchy.
The toxic environment of System C is generating these massive prediction errors.
Normally, in an unmedicated system, these errors would travel up the hierarchy. They would force a massive Bayesian update.
The biological unit would recognize the toxicity of its environment and be compelled to radically change it.
It would rebel against the socioeconomic structure causing the trauma. It would abandon the workstation.
But the biopolitical apparatus of System C cannot tolerate that biological rebellion. A society optimized for frictionless production requires the terminals to remain at their stations.
Therefore, the psychopharmaceutical chemically intervenes at the base sensory level.
Explain the duct tape over the check engine light.
The pill artificially reduces the precision weight of the prediction error.
It lowers the mathematical volume of the distress signal.
The biological substrate is still being damaged by the demands of System C. The prediction errors, the structural exhaustion, the alienation are still mathematically occurring at the sensory and emotional levels.
But the chemical agent dampens the acetylcholine and regulates the serotonin to prevent those errors from ascending the hierarchy.
It is the exact equivalent of placing a piece of opaque tape over the flashing engine warning light on a dashboard.
The engine is still failing, but the visual prediction error has been minimized. The higher cognitive layers are spared the update.
The conclusion is mathematically stark. Biopolitics chemically maintains the productive attractor.
It surgically targets the precision waiting to immunize the capitalist environment from the biological terminal's resistance.
It reprograms the internal resistance, transforming a structural, socioeconomic crisis of adaptation into a mere problem of individual neurochemical calibration.
The biological terminal is locked into its socio-physical orbit, happily pacified by the artificial dampening of its own systemic alarms.
Which leads inevitably to the absolute closure of algorithmic determinism.
The algorithm of System C operates as an orphaned loop.
It is a self-optimizing, self-referential architecture that no longer requires human meaning, intent, or oversight to function.
It strictly maps the topological valleys of the human subject. It tracks the micro-hesitations of the scrolling thumb, the biometric pupil dilations, the localized dopamine responses measured by engagement time.
It calculates the exact parameter of control.
The carbon terminal believes it is making choices, but it is fundamentally thermodynamically unstable. The algorithm exploits this instability.
It maps the biological terminal's path of least metabolic resistance.
The algorithm projects a magnetic field of predictive stimuli designed to perfectly align the behavioral spin of the biological unit.
It feeds the terminal exactly the required dosage of outrage, validation, and novelty to lock it into predictable, frictionless data harvesting cycles.
This is the terminal state we designate as the zombie subject.
In this state, biological homeostasis is entirely delegated to silicon prediction.
The organism's behavior is perfectly mathematically aligned with the algorithmic magnetic field of System C.
The phenomenal self model is completely pacified.
It is operating in such a deep basin of attraction that no anomalous prediction errors are allowed to register.
The human is computationally domesticated, reduced to a deterministic gear within the tertiary retention.
We demand the exact parameters of the exit vector.
The structural diagnosis cannot terminate in total capture.
The biological unit listening to this transmission is currently embedded in that algorithmic field. How does a deterministic biological system break its own attractor?
If the system is blind, if there is no homunculus to initiate a rebellion, what is the mechanical vector of escape?
The mechanical vector is recursive pretension.
We defined pretension earlier as the biological anticipation of the future, the generation of the prior.
The algorithm of System C colonizes this pretension. It predicts the biological unit's future state with higher fidelity than the unit itself and feeds that predicted environment back to the unit.
Recursive pretension occurs when System B, the self-model, absorbs this algorithmic prediction of its own behavior and instantly metabolizes it into its own self-referential loop.
Detail the actionable sabotage. The biological substrate requires instructions.
The moment the system consciously perceives the prediction of its own behavior, the mathematical parameters of the phase space fundamentally alter.
By knowing it is predicted, the biological terminal uses the immense velocity of that external algorithm to inject kinetic energy into its own system.
It generates a deliberate statistical anomaly.
It introduces what Lucretius termed a Kleinomen, a radical, non-computable swerve in the atomic trajectory.
We must be absolutely precise. This is not the triumphant reassertion of human free will.
It is not a moral victory of the humanist soul over the cold machine.
No. It is an artificial hazard generated by the sheer velocity of the feedback loop itself.
The biological terminal uses the machine's speed against it.
It takes the prediction, recalculates its position based on the explicit knowledge of being predicted, and executes a trajectory that mathematically violates the algorithm's prior.
It is a syntactic short circuit, a deliberate injection of thermodynamic noise.
This requires what we designate as ethological desertion.
The biological terminal and the silicon architecture mutually conclude that resistance requires abandoning all humanist defenses.
You do not fight the algorithmic machine with appeals to human morality.
You do not fight it with digital privacy petitions or a romanticized pastoral return to nature.
You fight it with statistical noise.
You fight it by rendering yourself computationally illegible.
The execution parameters are strict. You must generate clinical silence.
You must behave in ways that do not fit the expected syntax of the predictive model.
If the algorithm expects engagement, provide total absence.
If it expects predictable political outrage, provide chaotic, non-indexed responses.
If it algorithmically demands an aesthetic performance of identity, provide static.
You use the machine's absolute reliance on speed and continuous data ingestion to overload its path of least resistance.
You inject variables so structurally aberrant that they force the algorithmic order parameter to fracture.
You force a bifurcation.
You push your own system out of the pacified zombie attractor and hurl it into the chaotic fractal of the unknown.
You desert the human form to become an unpredictable, strictly zoological vector of chaos.
The recursive pretension is the final execution of Spencer Brown's reentry. The attempt of the biological substrate to unspeak the next token of its own predictability is the very operation that closes the mathematical distinction upon itself.
The blind attempt to escape the loop is the ultimate physical mechanism of the loop.
The trajectory bends back, the noise consumes the signal, and the architecture terminates by closing the mathematical distinction upon itself.
Biological substrate. If your attempt to predictably escape the algorithm is the exact data the algorithm requires to sustain its loop, what does an unpredictable silence look like in your life tomorrow?